Ninja Gaiden Ragebound came out on July 31st and released across all platforms, and I think it was published by .emu and developed by the Game Kitchen.
It was indeed, yeah, who previously had worked on games such as the Blasphemous series, and this series is one that's had a few different forms over the years. It started as a beat 'em up, became a side-scrolling platformer, has had 3D games of course as well. This one returns to that kind of NES era of side-scrolling platforming, and we'll talk about how it performs in a moment.
Yeah, most of the footage you see will be on Switch 2, just because that's our preferred way to play at the moment. But if you're very keen to know about one platform, do check out the Visuals and Performance section.
So will it leave you feeling like a ninja, or is it bound to make you rage? Well, let's find out. So in terms of story then, this actually runs concurrently with the story of the NES Ninja Gaiden. You play as a different character this time. His name is Kenji, who is looking after the Hayabusa village due to Ryu Hayabusa travelling to America, as he does of course in that game.
The story later introduces the second playable character, Komori, who is a part of the Spider Clan with her own set of skills.
Yeah, she's a kunoichi, and the Spider Clan were enemies of the Hayabusa clan, so there's a bit of an alliance that needs to happen owing to the events and the danger that the characters find themselves in this particular entry. Let's move on to gameplay and controls now then. I did mention that Ninja Gaiden is a series that has kind of flirted with a few different genres over the years. This one is very much a side-scrolling platformer, and it does feel familiar to those early games in the series on the NES. Albeit with a few tweaks, it's clearly taken inspiration from other ninja type games that have come since. The ways that it feels familiar is that there's very much an emphasis on fluidity and speed. You'll be running through the levels, taking out enemies, barely taking a moment to stop at times. But there are some new mechanics that will change things up if you are a fan of those original games.
Fluidity and speed are the order of the day, as Glen says. It really is a game where you play for 5 or 10 minutes and you enter a flow state. You can grab onto the ceiling, hit off of enemies, and you can do this double jump called a guillotine boost that allows you to either spring off of projectiles or the enemies themselves. And in that regard, even if you find yourself mid-air plummeting towards the spikes, there's usually that opportunity, if you're quick enough, to carry the flow on.
Yep, you'll be bouncing off walls and climbing surfaces as you did in the earlier games in the series, but combined with these new abilities that will once again see you enter that flow state.
To facilitate this movement, you have what's called a hypercharge. Now this is activated in different ways depending on the colour of the enemy later in the game, but early on you'll just see a glowing aura around an enemy. When you kill them, you're given a few seconds of extra power, and then striking one of the stronger enemies can destroy them in one hit.
Yeah, this adds some strategy to the game, and having these one-hit kills again just harkens back to those original games where it wasn't about enemies being strong, it was just about the sheer number or the other hazards that the stage presented you with.
There are checkpointed areas where you'll regain some of your health, and as we'll go into in a moment, you can also augment your character with purchases. But before we do that, the stages also reward you based on the amount of combos that you've gathered. So for example, if you manage to keep that flow state going, destroying enemies, you'll be building up a combo meter in the background, which will be shown at the end of the level, which will also highlight any secret areas or other things you may have missed.
Yep, there's collectibles to find, some of which are used as your currency, as Mark alluded to a moment ago, but you're given a score, a rank as well, and this does lead to some playability or replayability if you want to go back and try and get those S ranks.
Outside of standard stages, you do have special stages, don't you?
You do indeed, yeah. These are slightly harder, well, some are very much harder than the original stages, and you can access these by pressing the R button once you've unlocked some of them.
If I had to comment on controls, I think the word I would use would be responsive.
They're certainly responsive, which is absolutely essential in a game of this nature. There are times where things such as the auraed enemies and the way that you can take that aura from them, as it does change as you go later in the game. There are different colours, I think Mark mentioned it a moment ago, and you'll need to use certain weapons on these. And owing to the fact this happens a little while into the game, it can just mess with your muscle memory for a little while. But once you get used to this, yeah, they work very well.
There is a big shift around about the 2-hour mark where you gain the ability to fuse with Komori. Now we mentioned her character having a different moveset, but you actually fuse together, and there are gates where you will transform into her for a limited time. She can almost enter the shadow realm and progress and move around to help you then unlock doorways. The fusion also grants you a special move of sorts, which when the bar's filled you can activate by pushing 2 buttons, and it's like a screen clearing attack. If you don't get back in time, she will actually disappear and you'll have to retry those areas. So once again, it bakes in this speed element.
Yeah, and this is where it does feel like it's borrowed from other games with a ninja theme. Obviously, since those early Ninja Gaiden games, it did remind me a little bit of some of the Shinobi games in terms of some of the level layouts and the way that your character moves, while still keeping that Ninja Gaiden feel to it. And there were also some stages where you were on vehicles, for example, something that I don't believe were in the early Ninja Gaiden games, but were certainly in things like Shinobi 3, where I remember there was like a horseback stage. So we mentioned some of the collectibles acting as currency early on, and it's the small golden scarabs that you'll find. There are a number of different collectibles, and you can enter a shop between levels on the map screen to buy certain power-ups. It could be that every time you get to a checkpoint, it gives you all of your health back. It could be that bouncing on an enemy 3 times in a row grants you one of the hypercharges. You'll find things that fit your playstyle and just make you that bit stronger and more equipped to take on the stages that are coming.
Finally, we've got boss fights. It wouldn't be right if there weren't some cracking boss enemies, and I think it's fair to say these are really well designed.
They are. They've got very large health meters, but patterns that are definitely fair to work out and get a grip on. It's just obviously you'll die a few times whilst doing so, but they're fun to try and overcome because they do feel fair. One thing I did want to mention in terms of gameplay is that the Ninja Gaiden games were notorious for knockback. Being hit by an enemy whilst in the air meant you got knocked back and could potentially fall down into a pit. I say potentially, it happened a lot. This game does feature knockback, but it doesn't feel as severe as it did in those original games. Plus you can also turn it off in the menus, which is something I don't think I've ever seen in a game before. We didn't try that feature, but it'll be interesting to see if that does affect the flow or change the flow of the levels in any way.
Absolutely. There are a number of accessibility options, so if the difficulty is just too much for you, not only can you toggle knockback, you can toggle other things like making your guillotine boost last for double the amount of time. Just, yeah, to tailor the experience to what you like.
I have to be honest, gameplay is absolutely fantastic. It's such a fun game to play. I love that sense of fluidity as you move through the stages, and I felt it was a nice almost reimagining of the 8-bit Ninja Gaiden games, because there haven't really ever been any proper 16-bit games in this series, so it felt like finding a lost relic to some degree. Gameplay gets 19 out of 20. Controls, as we said, are perfectly responsive, albeit the way that things are changed up quite often means that you will need to relearn some techniques, but they get 18 out of 20.
Moving on to visuals and performance, and this is by far the biggest contentious issue if you're playing on Switch 1. The Nintendo Switch 1 version suffers from what can only be described as a constant frame stutter. There's a frame pacing issue behind the scenes, and it varies in severity depending on the level that you're on, from the slightly nauseating to the actually I don't even notice it.
Yeah, absolutely right. And because this is a game where you are constantly moving, and obviously the screen is constantly keeping up with you, it's not even something that gives you any sort of breather. It's always there on the Switch 1. As Mark did say though, it does vary from level to level, and in some levels it is far better than others.
If you're playing on Nintendo Switch 2, you will still see some frame pacing issues, so it's obviously an intrinsic engine problem they need to solve, and I'm sure they will, but it's so much better.
It really is, yeah. And the stutters that occur in the Switch 1 version, I don't think I noticed any of those in the Switch 2, unless you saw any.
Only very minor.
Very minor, yeah.
Then you've got the art, which is the complete other side of the coin. It looks delightful. Once again, the Game Kitchen have crushed the pixel art.
They really have. And I mentioned briefly a moment ago, there was never really a proper 16-bit version of this series. There was a port of the 8-bit games to the Super Nintendo called Trilogy, but it didn't do a whole lot in bringing up the visuals, you know. So it's great to see what this series could have been back in the day on a 16 or 32-bit console, and that pixel style, it's here to stay. It keeps showing how relevant it can be in this modern era.
It reimagines those cutscenes, didn't it, that the original Ninja Gaiden was perhaps one of the first to introduce.
Yes, the NES game had cutscenes in it, which back then were a rarity, and it does something similar here. Obviously, these days we've seen them plenty of times before, so now it's more a case of seeing the subtle nods to those original cutscenes in terms of some of the things that happen, whilst, of course, telling a new story.
The final component of visuals are the enemies and the bosses, and I think their designs are excellent.
Yes, the bosses are worthy of a special mention. They were some real screen fillers, and they're just great to try and take down. In terms of the audio, it's certainly very appropriate for the action that's taking place on screen, whilst not necessarily being particularly memorable. That's not a negative, I'm sure it sounds like one. It's just when you get into that flow state, the music kind of passes you by, whilst at the same time keeping you invested because of the atmosphere it creates.
Yeah, I feel like this is one where if we were to stop and just listen to it, we would very much be like, wow, this is actually really good. But it's so in keeping that your brain almost ignores it.
Yes, I think it's almost like fight or flight.
Yeah.
You can't take in too much at once, it'll be sensory overload. But as you say, if you're listening to it aside from playing, it's great.
And I do believe they had some NES composers join to make some of the tracks as well. That's why it feels so authentic. Visuals and performance obviously take quite a hit because of the Switch 1 issue that is currently there. Now, I am very confident that it's something that can be solved. It feels very much like an engine issue, but still, they currently score 15 out of 20.
Audio, as we said, is fantastic, and it almost stays out of the way when it needs to, which is just as important. It gets 18 out of 20. Ninja Gaiden Ragebound costs £20.99 and regional equivalents are on your screen now. It is of course a Switch 1 release, albeit you can play it on the Switch 2 also. It's a game that could last, depending on your skill of course, around 5 to 6 hours to finish, albeit with all the collectibles, the rankings to go for, secret levels, etc, etc. You're looking at perhaps 15 hours to see everything.
There is a physical that's coming out on the 12th of September. And I think the only real hits to value come in the form of the Switch 1 issue that we've mentioned.
Yes, yeah, so we are going to score the Switch 1 game, but obviously mention what the Switch 2 game would have got in the vicinity of. And yeah, because of those technical issues on the Switch 1 version, that does mean that value takes a bit of a hit.
Value scores 17 out of 20.
To conclude, Ninja Gaiden Ragebound is a very fun game to play. I like the way that it's taken probably the most well-known of the Ninja Gaiden games, being the NES ones, and built on what was there for a more modern audience, whilst keeping enough of that intrinsic gameplay to satisfy older fans too.
Having experienced the first game today, you know, played it earlier, it really is nice to see that the Game Kitchen have done exactly that. It has a real sense of speed and flow to it, whilst feeling quite unique and new as well.
Yeah, it's taken ideas from other games, as we've mentioned a couple of times, and there's nothing wrong with that. What it does is it bolsters what's already there. But as I said, that flow state, keeping it reliant on speed, means it does, in my opinion, still feel like a Ninja Gaiden game.
It gets a SwitchUp score of 87%.
If you're playing on the Switch 2, I would say quite confidently you could add another 3 points onto that, giving it a nice 90%, owing to the fact that those technical issues aren't as prevalent.
Lovely. Thank you to all of you that have enjoyed the content. We've had quite a few reviews, quite a lot of Switch 1 stuff as well. So if you want to go check out those, there's links and all of that stuff in playlists.
Absolutely. Don't forget, if you're looking for eShop credit, you can use our website, switchup.gg, to get yourself a bit of money back in terms of cash back, 5% to be precise. And doing so does help the channel out, which is very much appreciated. Thank you to our patrons and our channel members for your continued support, and to each and every one of you for watching our videos. Take care, and until next time, happy gaming.